Hello, and welcome to Real World Enterprise Architecture. My name is Marco Fernandez. I'm an enterprise architect and business advisor, and this is a space where architecture meets reality, where frameworks are tools, not shields, where clarity matters more than compliance, and where architects are expected to take responsibility not just for what they design, but for the role they choose to play inside their organizations. Today's episode is about strategy, but not a strategy as it's usually discussed, not as a slide deck presented once a year, not as a vision statement full of safe words and empty promises. Today, we're going to talk about strategy as it actually exists inside of organizations: incomplete, contested, political, and often deeply uncomfortable. And more importantly, we're going to talk about the architect's role in shaping it or avoiding it. There is a quiet belief that many architects carry with them throughout their careers, a belief so normalized that it rarely gets questioned. The belief that strategy belongs to executives and architects are merely there to align, to receive direction, to translate intent into structure, to wait. That belief is not just wrong, it is professionally fatal. Because if you wait for a strategy to come from above, you're not an architect, you're a technician. That sentence tends to trigger resistance, especially from people who see themselves as disciplined, methodical, and responsible professionals. And I understand why. Architects are often taught to value neutrality, to avoid politics, to stay objective, to let leadership decide and then do the technical work of making things coherent. It sounds mature, it sounds professional, and it sounds completely reasonable until you look at the consequences. The moment you step away from strategy, you step away from relevance. Architecture that isn't connected to strategy doesn't disappear. It doesn't become harmless. It becomes reactive. It responds instead of leads. It chases priorities instead of shaping them. It optimizes systems around goals that no one has clearly articulated. And over time, it turns into something organizations barely tolerate rather than actively seek out. Eventually, it's treated exactly how reactive noise is treated, as overhead. What makes this particularly dangerous is that most architects don't experience this as a sudden failure. It's gradual, subtle. You start out with influence. You're invited early, your opinion matters. Then, slowly, the invitations stop coming. Decisions are already made by the time you're consulted. Your role shifts from shaping direction to validating it. And one day, without anyone ever saying it out loud, architecture is no longer where direction is discussed, it's where decisions are documented. Most architects don't notice when this shift happens, or rather, they notice it, but they rationalize it. They tell themselves the organization is immature, that leadership doesn't get architecture, that the strategy is messy anyway, that their job is to bring order, not challenge power. And so they adapt. They become better translators, better aligners, better producers of artifacts. But alignment without judgment is not leadership, it's compliance with better formatting. This is where we need to be very precise, because the problem is not that architects lack strategic intelligence. On the contrary, most enterprise architects I've met have an excellent grasp of systems thinking, long term implications, and cross functional trade offs. The problem is not capability, the problem is posture. Architects are often trained into passivity. They are taught explicitly or implicitly that the strategy is something sacred, something above their pay grade, something they shouldn't touch unless invited. And so they learn to wait. They wait for clarity. They wait for decisions. They wait for priorities to stabilize. And while they wait, they tell themselves they are being prudent. But in complex organizations, clarity does not arrive fully formed. It emerges through tension, debate, and iteration. Someone has to force the questions. Someone has to surface the contradictions. Someone has to articulate the implications of competing priorities. And when architects refuse to play that role, they don't preserve neutrality, they abandon the field. This is where a critical distinction gets blurred, the difference between supporting a strategy and shaping it. Supporting a strategy sounds noble, safe, cooperative, but in practice, it often means taking whatever vague, conflicting, or politically compromised direction exists and making it look structured. It means turning ambiguity into diagrams. It means creating the appearance of coherence without resolving the underlying tension. That is not architecture. That is institutionalized avoidance. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many architects prefer it that way because shaping a strategy is risky. It means asking questions that expose disagreement. It means challenging assumptions held by people with formal authority. It means being seen as difficult instead of compliant. And it means accepting that influence comes with cost. Frameworks don't demand that of you. Alignment doesn't demand that of you, but strategy does. So instead of engaging, many architects retreat into method. They tell themselves that if they follow the process correctly, value will emerge, that rigor will compensate for the lack of influence, that neutrality will protect them from conflict, and over time, they confuse methodological discipline with strategic contribution. This is where the damage becomes systemic. Organizations don't marginalize architects because they hate architecture. They marginalize architects because those architects have chosen safety over consequence, because they've decided it's better to be correct than to be relevant, because they've avoided the political and human complexity of a strategy and retreated into the comfort of a structure. And the organization learns a lesson from that behavior. It learns that architecture is not where hard choices are made. It learns that architects will adapt to wherever direction emerges, no matter how incoherent. It learns that the strategy can be negotiated elsewhere and architecture will catch up later. That is not a failure of recognition, it is a failure of positioning. This episode is about reclaiming that position, not by demanding authority, not by pretending architects should replace executives, but by recognizing that strategy is not something you wait for. It is something you participate in shaping, whether you admit it or not. And the only real choice you have is whether you do it consciously or by default. If you wait, the strategy will still be shaped, just without you. And when that happens, don't be surprised if your work is treated as an afterthought. That is the conflict we are going to unpack in this episode. One of the most persistent misconceptions in enterprise architecture is the idea that strategic relevance comes from alignment. That if you align well enough, if you faithfully translate business intent into structure, your value will eventually be recognized. This belief is deeply ingrained, reinforced by frameworks, maturity models, and organizational language that rewards compliance over contribution. But alignment, when misunderstood, becomes a trap. We've trained architects to believe their job is to take a strategy as an input, something upstream, something already decided, something to be respected rather than interrogated. And so, architects focus on mapping, tracing, and structuring, always careful not to question whether the thing they're aligning to actually makes sense. This is where architecture quietly stops being a leadership discipline and becomes a clerical one. Because alignment without challenge does not resolve ambiguity, it preserves it. It takes conflicting priorities, incompatible objectives, and unresolved trade offs and gives them a clean visual representation. And once ambiguity has been formalized, it becomes much harder to confront. The diagram creates the illusion that the problem has been solved, when in reality, it has only been deferred. That's why architecture that isn't connected to strategy will always become reactive noise. It doesn't fail loudly, it fails politely. It produces artifacts on time, it follows the process, it passes governance reviews, and yet, when the organization is forced to make real decisions under pressure, architecture is nowhere to be found. It is consulted too late or not at all. Not because it lacks intelligence, but because it has trained the organization to see it as a translation service, not as a source of direction. Another common mistake architects make is confusing neutrality with professionalism. Many architects pride themselves on being objective, on staying above politics, on not taking sides. They believe this makes them credible. In practice, it makes them irrelevant. There is no such thing as neutral architecture. Every architectural decision implies preference. Every capability model prioritizes certain outcomes over others. Every roadmap encodes assumptions about pace, risk, and value. Pretending otherwise doesn't make you objective, it just hides your influence behind technical language. This is where the language architects use becomes revealing. Phrases like we're just enabling, we're just supporting, or we're just aligning sounds humble, but they often mask a deeper abdication of responsibility. They signal that the architect sees themselves as downstream, that they believe strategic incoherence is someone else's problem. But incoherence doesn't stay upstream. It flows into design decisions. It manifests as architectural depth. It shows up as rework, delays, and missed opportunities. And by the time those consequences are visible, it's already too late to claim neutrality. Another mistake is the belief that challenging strategy requires authority. This assumption keeps many architects silent. They tell themselves that without a formal mandate, without an executive title, without explicit permission, they have no right to question direction. So they wait. And while they wait, decisions get made elsewhere, often badly. But the strategy is rarely shaped by authority alone. It's shaped by whoever can frame the problem most clearly under uncertainty. Whoever can articulate trade offs in a way that forces choice, whoever can connect consequences across silos. Authority helps, but clarity persuades. Architects are uniquely positioned to provide that clarity. They see the interdependencies others miss. They understand how local decisions ripple across the entire enterprise. They can anticipate second and third order effects, and yet many choose to not to speak because speaking will mean stepping into discomfort. This brings us to one of the most damaging habits in the profession: waiting for clarity. Architects often say things like, once the strategy is clear, we can design properly. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. In reality, it's an excuse. The strategy is rarely clear upfront. It becomes clear through iteration, tension, and informed challenge. Clarity is not a prerequisite for architecture, it is one of its outputs. By waiting for clarity, architects signal that they see themselves as executors, not contributors, and organizations respond accordingly. This is how the role quietly degrades. At first, architects are invited early, then they are consulted later. Eventually, they are asked to validate decisions already made, and finally, they are asked to document outcomes they had no hand in shaping. At each step, the architect tells themselves this is temporary, that once the organization matures, things will change. They rarely do, because the organization has learned a pattern. It has learned that architects will not challenge direction, that they will adapt, that they will absorb uncertainty rather than expose it. And once that expectation is set, it's very difficult to reverse. This is why so many architects complain about a lack of strategic recognition while continuing to behave tactically. They want influence without friction, authority without confrontation, respect without risk. But a strategy does not work that way. Strategic relevance is not granted, it is earned, often by being the first person willing to say what others are thinking but avoiding. by naming contradictions, by surfacing uncomfortable implications, by refusing to turn noise into structure. And this is where we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many architects are complicit in their own marginalization, not because they lack the skill, not because they lack intelligence, but because they have internalized a role that prioritizes safety over significance. They've learned to perform architecture instead of practicing leadership. The the tragedy is that this behavior is often rewarded in the short term. Compliance is praised, artifacts are approved, conflict is avoided, but over time, the cost becomes clear. Architecture loses its seat at the table, not because it was excluded, but because it never claimed it. If there is one thing to take from this section, it's this: alignment is not the goal, alignment is the byproduct of clarity. And clarity only emerges when someone is willing to challenge the story being told. If that someone isn't the architect has already chosen their role. At this point, it's tempting to treat everything we've discussed as situational, to assume these failures only happen in poorly run organizations or immature ones, or environments where leadership simply doesn't understand architecture. That assumption is comforting and wrong. What we're dealing with here is not an isolated story, it's a pattern, one that repeats across industries, geographies, and levels of organizational maturity. I've seen it in financial institutions burdened by legacy systems and regulatory pressure. I've seen it in retailers chasing digital relevance while clinging to outdated operating models. I've seen it in logistic companies stretched across regions with conflicting priorities. And I've seen it in fast growing technology firms where speed replaces strategy and improvisation is mistaken for vision. The pattern is always the same. The organization announces a transformation, the language is ambiguous: customer centricity, agility, efficiency, innovation. The architecture team is mobilized, workshops are scheduled, frameworks are activated, artifacts begin to flow, but beneath the activity, something critical is missing. No one has made the hard choices. Different executives hold different interpretations of success. Different functions optimize for incompatible outcomes. Leadership speaks in slogans rather than decisions, and instead of confronting the incoherence, the architecture team tries to accommodate it. They design an architecture that includes everything, one that keeps options open, one that avoids saying no, one that looks flexible, inclusive, and forward thinking. In reality, it's directionless. This is the first version of the failure pattern, the architect as absorber of ambiguity. Rather than forcing strategic clarity, the architect absorbs uncertainty into the model. Every conflicting priority becomes another layer. Every unresolved tension becomes another capability. Every political compromise becomes another future consideration. The architecture grows more complex, more abstract, and less actionable, and everyone feels relieved temporarily. Executives feel heard. No one is challenged. No trade offs are made publicly. The architecture looks comprehensive, mature even. But the cost of that relief is deferred decision making, and deferred decisions don't disappear, they accumulate. Eventually, the organization hits a moment of pressure: a budget cut, a regulatory change, a competitive move, and suddenly changes must be made now. This is where the second version of the pattern appears. The architecture, which was supposed to guide decisions, becomes unusual, too broad, too generic, too accommodating. It doesn't tell leaders what to do, it tells them that everything could be done. And in moments of pressure, possibility is not helpful, direction is. So, leadership bypasses architecture. Decisions are made ad hoc. Projects are greenlit outside the roadmap. Exceptions multiply. Governance is labeled too slow, and architecture is blamed not for being wrong, but for being irrelevant. This is the moment many architects misinterpret. They assume the problem is execution or communication or maturity. They respond by tightening controls, adding more governance, producing more detailed artifacts, explaining the architecture more clearly. But the real problem occurred much earlier. The architect never challenged the absence of a strategy. They waited for clarity instead of forcing it. They designed around ambiguity instead of confronting it. Now, let's look at the second failure pattern, the architect who sees the problem but avoids the cost. These architects are different. They notice the contradictions, they understand the misalignment, they can articulate the trade offs, but they also understand the politics. They know who owns which agenda, they know which questions will trigger defensiveness, and they calculate the cost, so they stay quiet. They choose precision over impact, safety over influence. They tell themselves it's not the right time, that leadership isn't ready, that pushing now will be counterproductive, and maybe they're right in the short term. But over time, silence becomes complicity. The organization continues forward under false assumptions. Architecture continues to legitimize those assumptions by translating them into structure. And when the inevitable failure arrives, the architect has lost the moral authority to say, I saw this coming, because they didn't act when it mattered. This is where many architects experience burnout, not from overwork, but from powerlessness. They see problems forming but feel unable or unwilling to intervene. They become custodians of decisions they don't believe in, and slowly their role shifts from a strategic thinker to institutional caretaker. The third version of the pattern is rarer, but far more instructive. This is the architect who intervenes, not recklessly, not arrogantly, but deliberately. They ask questions early. They surface contradictions before they harden into commitments. They frame decisions in terms of trade offs rather than slogans. They connect technical implications to business consequences in ways that make avoidance uncomfortable. And yes, they pay a price. They are labeled difficult, political, sometimes even not collaborative. They experience pushback, resistance, occasionally exclusion. But something else happens as well. Over time, they become trusted, not because they are always right, but because they reduce ambiguity, because their presence changes the quality of conversation, because leadership learns that when this architect speaks, hard issues are surfaced early and not after failure. This is how strategic relevance is built, not through permission, but through pattern. And this is the part many architects underestimate. Influence is cumulative. Each intervention establishes precedent. Each moment of clarity builds credibility. Each avoided translation strengthens your position as someone who doesn't merely document decisions but helps shape them. The organizations where architecture truly matters are not the ones with the most mature frameworks. They are the ones where architects have earned the right to challenge direction because they've demonstrated judgment, timing, and courage. That right is not granted, it's built. And the difference between these patterns, the absorber, the silent, the observer, and the intervener, is not skill, it's choice. Every architect chooses repeatedly how close they are willing to get to a strategy, how much discomfort they will tolerate, how much responsibility they will accept for outcomes beyond the diagram, and over time, those choices compound. By the time architecture is labeled irrelevant, the decision has already been made, quietly, incrementally, and often by the architect themselves. At this point, we need to confront something most architecture conversations carefully avoid. Strategy does not exist in a vacuum. It does not emerge cleanly from rational analysis, and it is almost never shaped in rooms where everyone has equal power, equal incentives, or equal information. Strategy lives inside organizations, and organizations are human systems. That means strategy is shaped by authority, yes, but also by influence, by relationships, by timing, by narrative, by fear, by ambition, and by what people are willing or unwilling to confront in public. This is where many architects lose their footing. They've been trained to think in terms of structure, logic, and traceability. They are comfortable when problems are bounded, when assumptions are explicit, when criteria are agreed upon. But the strategic conversations are rarely like that. They are messy, they are ambiguous, they are charged, and when they often involve competing truths rather than clear right answers. So, architects withdraw. They tell themselves this is politics, and therefore beneath the discipline, that their role is to stay clean, objective, above the fray. But what they fail to see is that by stepping away, they don't eliminate politics. They simply remove themselves from where it's happening. And a strategy moves on without them. This is where the concept of influence without authority becomes critical. Most enterprise architects do not have formal decision making power. They do not own budgets. They do not command teams. They cannot mandate outcomes. And because of that, many assume they have no strategic leverage. That assumption is wrong. Influencing organizations rarely comes from title alone. It comes from the ability to reduce uncertainty when it matters most, from the ability to frame choices in ways that force clarity, from the ability to connect disparate concerns into a coherent picture when others are stuck in silos. This is where architects have a natural advantage, if they choose to use it. But influence without authority requires a very different posture than most architects are comfortable with. It requires stepping into conversations early, before decisions harden. It requires asking questions that slow things down temporarily in order to prevent a much larger failure later. And it requires tolerating the discomfort of being seen as disruptive before being seen as valuable. Let's be clear about something. Shaping strategy is not about winning arguments. It's about shaping the field in which arguments occur. The architect who tries to dominate the room will fail. The architect who tries to stay invisible will fail as well. The architect who succeeds is the one who changes the quality of thinking in the room, who reframes the problem, who introduces constraints that were previously ignored, who makes trade offs explicit when others are content to leave them implicit. This is subtle work, and it is risky because the moment you surface a real trade off, you expose someone's priorities. You reveal that not everything can be achieved at once. You force people to confront loss as well as gain, and that creates resistance. This is why timing matters. One of the most common mistakes architects make when attempting to influence a strategy is intervening too late. They wait until decision is already socially locked in, until commitments have been made, until regulations are at stake, and then they raise concerns, technically valid concerns that no one is psychologically prepared to hear. At that point, resistance is inevitable. Influence without authority requires intervening earlier, when ideas are still fluid and identities are not yet attached, when people are still exploring options rather than defending positions. That means architects must be present upstream, not waiting for formal invitations, but positioning themselves as contributors to sense making, not just solution design. This is also where narrative becomes a strategic tool. Data matters, analysis matters, models matter, but strategy is ultimately driven by stories about who we are as an organization, what kind of future we believe in, what risks we are willing to take, what we fear losing. Architects who want to shape a strategy must learn to speak into those narratives, not with hype, but with grounded insight. They must be able to say, if this is the story we're telling ourselves, here's where it leads. And just as importantly, if we believe in this, here's what we must stop doing. This is not manipulation, it is responsibility. And here's the part that many architects resist most strongly. Engaging at this level requires accepting that influence is personal. People don't trust roles, they trust individuals. They don't follow frameworks, they follow judgment, which means your credibility is always on the line. You cannot hide behind the method. You cannot defer to the standard. You cannot say the framework says and expect that to carry weight in strategic conversations. What carries weight is your ability to reason, to listen, to synthesize, and to speak with clarity under uncertainty. This is why neutrality is such a dangerous illusion. By refusing to take a position, architects believe they are protecting themselves. In reality, they are signaling that they are unwilling to carry the burden of choice, and organizations quickly learn not to look to those people when choices must be made. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is consent. Every time you choose not to challenge an incoherent strategy, you reinforce it. Every time you translate ambiguity into structure without comment, you legitimize it. And every time you wait for permission to speak, you teach the organization that your voice is optional. This is how influence erodes. Now, let's address the fear directly because it's real. Yes, shaping a strategy involves risk. You may be misunderstood, you may be labeled political, you may be excluded from certain conversations temporarily. These are the real costs. But the alternative cost is far greater, becoming irrelevant while remaining busy. Strategic architects are not fearless, they are deliberate. They chose when to intervene. They understand the personalities in the room. They read the context. They frame the contributions in ways that invite reflection rather than trigger defense. And when they do challenge, they do so with clarity and respect, not aggression. This is leadership without authority, and it is learned through practice, not certification. If you want to shape a strategy, you must stop thinking of it as something handed down to you. A strategy is a living process, and architecture becomes strategic the moment you engage with that process as a participant, not a spectator. The question is not whether you have permission, the question is whether you are willing to accept the responsibility. Now, let's bring this out of theory and into action. Because if this episode ends as an interesting reflection and nothing changes in how you behave next week, then it has failed. The shift from aligning to a strategy to shaping it does not require a new title, a reorganization, or formal authority. It requires a different set of moves small, deliberate, and repeatable. The first move is to stop hiding behind the vague language. The next time you hear someone say, "This is aligned with our strategy," pause. Don't argue. Don't contradict. Simply ask a clarifying question. Which strategic choice does this support? Not which objective, not which initiative, which choice. What are we explicitly saying yes to? And therefore, what are we saying no to? Most rooms go quiet at this point, not because people are unintelligent, but because the choice was never articulated. And in that moment, you have already shifted the conversation. You have moved it from aspiration to decision. The second move is to surface consequences early. Architects are uniquely positioned to do this, yet many avoid it because it feels confrontational. But surfacing consequences is not an attack, it is a service. When you say, if we prioritize speed here, we're implicitly accepting higher operational risk later. You're not blocking progress, you are making the cost visible. When you say, this operating model requires a level of governance discipline we do not currently have, you are not being negative, you are being honest. A strategy collapses when consequences remain implicit. The third move is to stop translating noise into a structure. This is perhaps the hardest one because it goes directly against how architects have been rewarded for years. You will feel the urge to clean things up, to reconcile contradictions, to make everything fit. Resist that urge. Sometimes the most strategic thing an architect can do is to refuse to produce a diagram until the direction is clarified. Not aggressively, not dramatically, calmly, explicitly. I can model this, but first we need to resolve these two competing priorities because they lead to fundamentally different architectures. That moment takes courage, but it also resets expectations. It teaches the organization that architecture is not there to absorb confusion, it is there to expose it. Now, let's talk about presence. If you want to shape a strategy, you have to be in the room where it's discussed. But being in the room is not enough. Many architects sit quietly in strategic meetings, listening carefully, taking notes, and saying very little. They tell themselves they are learning the business, observing, being patient. Observation has value, silence does not. You earn your place in strategic conversations by contributing meaningfully, by asking questions that shape sharpen thinking, by reframing problems in ways that reveal trade offs, by connecting dots that others don't see, and yes, sometimes by saying things that make the room uncomfortable, briefly. This is where we need to be honest. If you consistently leave strategic meetings thinking, I had thoughts, but it wasn't the right moment, the problem is not timing, it's posture. You are waiting for safety. A strategy does not reward safety, it rewards clarity under uncertainty. Now, let's address the emotional side of this because it matters. Shaping a strategy will test your identity. You will no longer be able to hide behind the technical one or the method expert. You will be exposed, your judgment will be visible, your reasoning will be questioned, and sometimes you will be wrong. That is the price of relevance. Many architects avoid strategy not because they don't understand it, but because they are afraid of that exposure. Frameworks protect you from being wrong in public. A strategy does not. It forces you to stand behind your thinking. That's why so many architects prefer alignment. It's safer. And it's why so many remain invisible. So let me be very direct in this final stretch. Stop calling yourself a strategic architect if you've never challenged a strategy. You cannot be strategic in a vacuum. You cannot be strategic from the sidelines. And you cannot be strategic while hiding behind neutrality. A strategy is not a document, it is an ongoing negotiation about the future of the organization. And architecture is either part of that negotiation or it is an afterthought. Architects who wait for a strategy become implementers. Architects who challenge it becomes shapers. And no, this does not mean being reckless. It means being deliberate. It means understanding context. It means choosing your moments. It means framing your interventions in ways that reduce ambiguity rather than escalate conflict. But it does mean speaking when silence will be easier. So, here's your challenge for this week. Ask one uncomfortable question about the strategy behind your current work. Just one. Ask it early, ask it respectfully, but ask it clearly. Push for choice, push for consequence, push for clarity. And if the answer is vague, don't rush to translate it into structure. Let the vagueness sit, let it be visible. That discomfort is not a failure. It is a signal that real strategic work needs to happen because a strategy is not sacred, it is shapeable. And architecture becomes strategic the moment you stop waiting and start participating. I'll leave you with this. If you wait for a strategy to come from above, you've already decided what role you are willing to play. Every diagram you create carries your bias, even when you call it the standard. Thank you for listening.